So this is the task 5, okay, and it's just about breaking this program into modules, okay. Now I've ripped out some of the codes that's already done for you, so you'll find that the actual task that you're doing is a bit better in terms of how it's weighed out, okay. When I've printed this out and when I've copied and pasted it, there's a wee bit of an issue in terms of the alignment there, okay, but don't worry about that just now, okay. So first part, it's basically this program is asking you for 5 values. These values have to be between 0 and 30, okay. So it's setting up an array of integers with 5 elements, and then it's just going through each index of the array asking you for an input, and there's a bit of input validation here just to say, well, if it is whatever you've typed in is less than 0 or it's above 30, then it's invalid, so ask for it again. What you'll probably find in your code that this was missed out, so if you typed in a number that was like 34, then if you'd get this invalid hit, but if you typed it in a valid hit after that, it would crash the program. So I noticed that in a few programs. So you just put this int function just to say, well, not int function, but just to say it's going to be an integer. So once you've filled up the array with 5 lots of hits between 0 and 30, what this does is it has a total, sets it to 0, and it just goes through each element, and it takes the value in the element and adds it to the grand total. So that's why it started at 0. So it goes through each one, and I'll go through when index is 1, 2, 3, etc. and I'll go through adding it to the grand total. And once it's come out of this fixed loop, it will then take the average, okay? So it will have the total there, divide it by 6 to get the average, okay? And then round the average, okay? After that, and then works at the points, and all it's saying there is if the total points is greater than 50 and average is greater or equal to 10, you've got 2 points, else if its total is greater than 50, 1 point, else 0 points, and then it's just outputting these, okay. Obviously the wee problem with average because it's meant to be 5 hits, okay, so a wee error in the code there, right. So what we've then got is, well, that's fair enough, that's a program you'd have done in National 5, so we need to make sure that you can actually split it into modules or sub-programs, okay? So it lends itself to split up into 4 areas: getting the number of hits, working out the total of all the hits, and then the condition of how you allocate points, and then outputting the number of points earned and average points earned, okay? So the average hits, right? So what we've got here is we have a top level program, okay? So this sits actually at the bottom of this code in Python, but it's actually asking it calls upon each function to do a specific task. If it needs information or data to do that task, it will pass it to these parameters, okay? So each within the brackets, that's 1 parameter, that's 2 parameters it's passing, that's 2 parameters. So you just basically count how many variables are in the brackets, and that's how many parameters. When it's within a call, this is a call statement because you're calling upon this function, that's an actual parameter, okay? So these are the actual variables that are used within the actual function or the procedure. Any variables used there, you'll be returning the values back into these variables that are on the left hand side of this equal sign, okay? So if we look at the first thing, right, first thing is to get the number of hits, okay? So we've got a function called get_hits. Now that function has to be exactly spelled like that, okay? So what we've got here is get_hits. So what happens there is it says, right, it calls upon get_hits. Now it doesn't have to pass it any information because it's actually expecting this function to give it the information, okay? So get_hits. So that is define a function called get_hits. You don't have to have any values within this. You're not passing it any you're not passing this function any parameters, but this function is passing these parameters back to the variable called hit list or hits list. Okay, now what's different from the previous programs is they're using the exact same variable names. So think about the variables that are used within the function as they're just being used for that instance the function's called and then it disappears. So that's why it's quite good practice to have a separate named variables, because right now you've got two, okay, now of the same name. So what will happen is it runs this bit of code, which is absolutely no different to the code I showed you, but once it's actually found out or filled up all this information, it then puts it back to hits list. Okay, so it sends it back the information back to hit list, this data structure. So that's the first one. It then goes down, it says, right, we're going to calculate the total and average, so call the function get total and average. Okay, so what happens here is it then doesn't need this anymore, it has this wee function. Okay, so this function is get total and average, so I'll just highlight this. Now it then says, right, I've got the information you need to calculate the average and the total, so it then just gives that information. Okay, so it passes that parameter. So that's the actual parameter, that's the formal parameter. Now what we've got here is we've got this variable still there. Now it's within this function, so it's called a local variable. Okay, any variables that are out with the function are global variables. That just means if all the functions can access it and use it. If it's just a local variable, it's only accessible to this function, and that's called the scope of the variable. The scope is local. Okay, so again what happens here is it works out the total, works out the average, and it returns these values. So it's returning total and it's returning average down to here. Okay, it has to return it in the same order. Okay, so if you had the word average and then total, what might happen is the average gets put into the total and the total gets put into the average, so you have to do it in order. Okay, so that's that function done. Once it's returned it, it goes on to the next line of the top level program. The next line is it's going to calculate the points. See what colour I've got for this one. Right, so it calculates the points. So it calls upon calculate points, and it needs to send it the information of total and average. Okay, so you'll find quite often it's sending it the information that the previous function it's passed. Okay, so it calculates total and average. It sends that. It says that, well, I'm going to call you to do your job, and for you to do your job properly, here's the values for total and average. Okay, so again, a wee local variable saying, well, points, and then it just works through the conditional statements, and once it's allocated the points, it then returns points back to this variable. Okay, so the values that are getting passed between the top level program to the function, and from the function to the back to the top level program, we just call this parameter passing. Okay, so, and if there's anything that the function requires in order to do its job, then you put it in the brackets. So get hits didn't require this top level program to do anything. It just required it to get all the hits from that function. But these two functions actually require information sent to it. Okay, last one is display details. Okay, so, and you'll notice that these on the left hand side, these are values that are getting written back from the functions back to the top level program. Display details, it doesn't actually need any value sent to it. Okay, it just needs it to display the information, but to display the information it does need points and average. So this is where it says, well, display details, so define display details, and you have to display the points and display the average. Okay, this comment is just, I think it's a spillover from the example 4. Okay, so it displays the points, displays the average, and then that's the program done. Okay, so obviously there's a wee error within the average, dividing it by 6 when it's to be 4, sorry, it's to be 5 bits of information. So you might have to look at the average, but you also might have to look at the actual for loop as well. Okay, but that's for you to work it. But hopefully that's kind of made it a wee bit simpler. Okay, so this top level program, this calls upon these procedures one at a time, or these functions one at a time. Okay, and when these functions aren't being used, they just sit there. The local variables within it aren't taking up any computer memory, okay, because global variables are always in the memory. Local variables are wiped as soon as that's not required, okay, and then that's you. Okay, so that's question 5, okay. Hopefully it's helped.